Okay, so I wanted to spend some time, now that we're kind of shifting out of the organisms that we find in streams, into thinking about how the kind of whole ecology of the system works in general. Now, the best way I think to do that is to look at a historical viewpoint of these river ecosystem concepts, or different ways we can model how the rivers work. Now, how this has generally been done is by breaking down the river into a more simplified model. Now, why do we do this? Well, there's like in physics, there's this idea that we want to get a theory of everything, a grand unified theory of physics, that so we can get an idea of how physics works, how our natural world works, from the subatomic up into the giant planets, solar systems, galaxies, galaxy clusters in the universe, right? This is basically a strive to unify all the forces in the universe, and so far physics has come up short. We don't really have an idea of that. Now, really, what stream ecologists want to do is the same thing. They want a unified theory of stream ecology, where we can have a model that explains how streams and rivers work in all habitats, ecoregions, with all species interactions and assemblages. Now, this is very difficult to do, as you can imagine. In some ways I can say physics is very simple because you don't have things living, right? It's very difficult to figure out a model to work in streams. Now, there's this famous quote in Einstein that everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. Okay, so when we think about a model, there's this really a fight between simplicity and complexity. So a model should tell you something about the system, but be easy to understand and approachable by a lot of different people. But it needs to be complex enough to apply to different scenarios. So specifically, when we're talking about rivers, it needs to work in all river types with all different organisms that are living there. So, we can think about a ecological model on this scale between information here and clarity. So think about a really simple model, right? A model that is too simple, it doesn't tell us anything. It might be pretty clear, but it might be completely wrong, right? It's just doesn't work in lots of different situations. That's because it just doesn't have enough information. But if on the other opposite, if you have a model that's extremely complex, that has so many variables, well, you might as well be just living in reality then, and there's no reason to compact your system into an easy to understand model. So what we want to do is have some sort of model of how rivers work with medium information that makes it clear, so most people can use it, and we can use it in different scenarios. So what's stopping us? Well, think about rivers. Rivers are continuously changing. That's in their nature. Think about that idea of dynamic equilibrium, where a river is continuously changing but staying the same in some senses. Rivers flow through different biomes. Rivers flow through, even if the river is in the same biome, comparing an Arctic river to a tropical rainforest river is very, very hard to do. Water comes from different sources, then you have different species inhabiting these areas, different elevations, different sizes of rivers. So if you were to tell like a terrestrial ecologist, I want to make a theory of terrestrial ecologists, they'd be like, well, what are you talking about? This is a little bit silly, because a forest is different from a desert, is different from an estuary, is different from the Arctic tundra, right? But I think there's still this push in stream ecology to try to get a theory that works across all river systems. So now we're going to kind of go through a bunch of different models, and we're going to talk about some good things about them and bad things about them. So I would go to the PowerPoint and look at the last slide and print that off, and then take some notes on that. That might help you. So the first attempt to model ecology in rivers had to do with European river zonation. Basically what they did was they grouped the river into different like spatial areas based on the species of fish they found. So there was a trout area, there was a grayling area, there was a barbel area, and then at the estuary there was bream. Now, some of you might not know what any of these fish are. So how do we generalize based on these different organisms, these species in particular, when we don't have those species? Okay, so we don't have barbel and bream in our systems, so we can't really use this European river zonation. People at the time then thought, okay, well, we have trout and we have other fish that do things like grayling and barbels. Well, we have catfish and bream. We have other fish that are like that. So maybe we can, generalize it by just using different fishes. But the problem with that is organismal-based zonations are fundamentally flawed, because organisms are really like exceptions to what we find, right? Each individual organism has adaptations that make it itself unique. So you cannot generalize that to another system when those species are not there. Then in 1980, Robin van Oort came out with this idea called the river continuum concept. Okay, and so this was really looking at the first large-scale synthesis of streams. And what it did was linked biotic processes with large-scale physical-chemical characteristics. So what do I mean by that? Basically, what it does is it takes the physical characteristics of the stream and links the biology. So we see certain biological things in streams due to the physical aspect of it. Now, let's take a closer look at this. Okay, so in headwater streams, what you're left, what it is you've got a forested headwater, and it's very shady, right? It's a very narrow stream that you can just jump across, and there's trees covering it all, the whole stream, right? So you might think about, well, there's not a lot of light, so there's not a lot of plankton, or I should say photosynthesis going on. But there is a lot of respiration. So those leaves and all the terrestrial organic matter is going into those headwater streams. And so what we have is photosynthesis divided by respiration is less than 1, right? Another way you can think about it is respiration here is bigger than photosynthesis in headwater streams. As you go downstream, though, and the stream widens, you're still at a relatively relatively shallow stream, but so light can penetrate into there, right? So you're shallow, but the stream is widening out, so you can actually get some direct sunlight hitting the stream. And so what you might get is a lot of periphyton growing, a lot more photosynthesis than respiration. And if you if you measure the total amount of photosynthesis and respiration, you do see that there is, in mid-order streams, more photosynthesis than respiration. But then when you get to larger rivers, you again switch to more respiration than photosynthesis. That's because most of the water volume now is in the aphotic zone, and what they said was energy is derived from leakage from upstream. So basically, a lot of the nutrients and organic matter leaks from upstream down into the downstream, and then makes that's what drives the river ecology. Then they made some little pie charts here where because it's a headwater stream that's basically driven by coarse particulate organic matter, leaves, you see a whole lot of shredders. Then with very few grazers in the headwaters. Then you see in the mid-order streams not as many shredders, but a whole lot of grazers. And then in the large order streams, you would see a lot of collectors and some predators too. And this is a really attractive idea. It's this idea that you get a continuum of ecology flowing down the river and changing slowly as the stream gets bigger. The thing is, these pie charts are not based on data. They're just an idea, and people kind of have taken it as fact. The RCC is kind of one of those examples where it's simple, but it's too simple and really never found to be true. What happens if you have a headwater that is not forested? This whole idea that photosynthesis is less than respiration could be completely incorrect, right? They completely ignore the lateral areas and how the river floods, and they think of the river as a linear system when it's not. It's really a network. And they also looked at carbon abundance versus carbon assimilation. So we'll talk about that here in a second. The RCC looked at only forested headwaters and forested streams. They never really looked at non-forested streams when that's really, a whole lot of streams across the world. And they also never took any data in large rivers. So when they built this riverine continuum concept, they just stopped in the mid-order streams because it just turns out the people that made this didn't have boats to be able to go and study ecology on big rivers. So the river continuum concept is a simple idea, just not true and overused just because people think it's too, they like it because it's this simple idea. In 1983 then, Ward and Stanford, they came out with the idea of the serial discontinuity concept. And I've met Jack Stanford, great guy. It just turns out that, this whole model that he was looking at was completely false because they were extending the RCC, the river continuum concept, into a dam, a regulated system, where they said that, if you have a dam, it basically just resets parameters based on what the dam is doing. It was largely theoretical, and since it was based on the RCC that was flawed to begin with, it's not true. The flood pulse concept. This is one of the PLQs that you should be looking at. So, written by Jung and others. And what they were doing is they were looking at tropical streams and looking at a lateral exchange of organic matter. So the RCC was kind of looking at downstream transport of organic matter from headwaters down to large rivers, where Jung in the flood pulse concept is saying, no, that's not what's important. What's important is this aquatic terrestrial transition zone where there's, as the river floods, this area, the riparian area, is really important because that's where all the action is, right? You have decomposing vegetation, you have aquatic macrophytes, you have a bunch of stuff falling into the floodplain that the organisms then can get at when the river floods. So they kind of put together this highway analogy where the main channel area was really just for movement, but that's riparian, the aquatic terrestrial transition zone was the real productive area where, so the highway, think about, like an interstate system is you move along the highway, you move along the river to get from place to place, but you get off the river, you get off the highway to fill up with gas, to get your food, to get your snacks. The thing is, there's a lot of problems with this, okay? In 2001, Glatton-Weimuller, I'm not sure how to say that, but looked at all the fish in North America and Europe and found that 30% of them required the flow in a river, in the main channel of a river, and about 50 to 80% of them depended on the main channel to complete at least a portion of their life cycle. Okay, and when you look at the flood pulse concept, really it's looking at the importance of this flood, right? It's in the name. The flood is the important part of the river. Now that's certainly true in the Amazon River, that floods like this for huge amounts of times of the year, 6 months of the year. But what about this river, right? This river in a gorge never floods, or if it does, this floodplain that's just right along here isn't going to really add anything to the ecology of the stream. The other thing is, let's say there are a bunch of organic matter that's in the floodplain. Does that organic matter actually get back into the stream after the flood? And the answer is we don't really know. So if the river floods, yes, it'll flood the whole river valley, and fish have access to the organic matter in this area, but we don't really know, does that actually make it back into the main channel? And then another problem with the flood pulse concept is many rivers don't flood predictably, right? We know that the Amazon River is going to flood for 6 months of the year, every single year. The fish know that. The fish have evolved and have life cycles for that. But in rivers that don't flood dependably, if it's not every year, if it's not at the same time every year, how can organisms depend on that? And it turns out they just don't. So the flood pulse concept is a great idea for tropical rivers, but it doesn't necessarily, you can't expand it across different river types. So what about the Riverine productivity model? This is a little bit more focused model that's kind of only looking at large rivers. Now, I should say that this guy Thorpe, he is my graduate school advisor, and Mike DeLong, I worked with him a little bit. So I know these guys, and but that doesn't make their stuff any less true. So what they were looking at is looking at this heterotrophy paradox, this idea that large rivers have more respiration than photosynthesis. Now think about this, that respiration versus photosynthesis. That's essentially saying that more energy is being used than is being created in a river. So think about the long-term consequences of that. That's like using up more calories than you're eating every single day, meaning you would get skinnier every day. Now, a river that's not a stable system, right? So what we do find is, yes, there is definitely more respiration going on than photosynthesis in the stream. But what's left out is an external food source. Okay? So if we look at in-stream production, we can see that there is a certain amount of photosynthesis going on. Okay. Now, some of that photosynthesis then is being used by the system, but there's a whole lot more. And what we see is that autochthonous, do I have that? Nope, sorry. There's this difference between allochthonous and autochthonous energy. I'll link those words to in the description, or see the description for just a definition of those words and how to spell them. But autochthonous means in-stream production, and allochthonous means out-of-stream production. So what we generally see is there's a whole lot of terrestrial carbon, terrestrial derived carbon. And what I mean by that is leaves, wood, dead things that go from the terrestrial system to get washed into the stream. So what we see is what the Riverine productivity model did was break the total food web of the system into two loosely connected modules. Okay, so there was an autochthonous module and an allochthonous module. So let's look at this autochthonous first. So this is autotrophic autochthonous carbon. So basically periphyton and phytoplankton that are created in stream. Where does that go? Now, most of it actually goes into the herbivores. Some of it goes into the microbial loop that we'll talk about here in a second. But think of it, the autochthonous carbon is driving the herbivores, which then that feeds up into the larger fish and the big fish. Now, some of that carbon is lost and gets decomposed, but what we have is the autochthonous, the periphyton, is really driving the metazoan food web. That means the organisms that we can see, the big things that you see. Now, but what happens to all the terrestrial carbon, the allochthonous carbon? That is put up into this microbial loop, basically eaten by bacteria and fungi. And that is just kind of recycled within the microbial loop. So when we see this heterotrophy paradox, right? How can you have a river a stable ecosystem if respiration is higher? What we see is, yes, respiration is higher because you have this dominance of total amount of carbon. Yes, there's more allochthonous carbon that is then put into this microbial food web than there is in the metazoan food web. So this is the aquatic carbon, the autochthonous carbon, which kind of stays within the big fish and the big invertebrates that you see and cycles in here. So you can have more respiration, but the autochthonous carbon is really driving the food web of the organisms that are living in their system. And this has been this was theorized in 1994 by these two guys, and then in 2002 they had some stable isotope data that really backed up their work. And because they put some limits on this food web model, it's been very successful. A lot of people have been able to use it to explain the ecology in different rivers, that being larger rivers that have this higher respiration compared to photosynthesis. Now, after Thorpe and DeLong wrote this Riverine productivity model, they kind of wanted to extend their ideas into a bunch of different like ecosystems, and they came up with the Riverine ecosystem synthesis. Now, there's some good things about this model. It's a patchy model rather than a continuum. So they had this idea that the river has different patches, in this case like different what we call functional process zones, like basically different channel patterns here. And what we know is that ecological processes are tied to these patches rather than longitudinal process, rather than just ecology of similar places or close places being more similar than places far away. What we see is that if you have a braided system here and a braided system here, the ecologies are going to be very similar. You might have different species upstream than downstream, but the whole ecological processes themselves will stay the same. And that idea, I think, is relatively well supported, but the whole idea of this model is this a really diffuse model that's really hard to calculate and really hard to use to so I think they basically overstepped their reach. Like, we don't really see these patterns, they're just too hard to calculate, so we don't really know what's going on with when you're going across river systems. So I think what's happening here is these FPZs need to be statistically determined, okay? And so this is the Murray-Darling River Basin in Australia, right down here in Southeast Australia. And you can see all these different functional process zones where the thing is, the anabranching here and the armored and the confined sections that we find in this river basin don't really translate to other watersheds. Even just nearby watersheds, you would have to do your own type of analysis. So the FPZs are extremely computationally difficult to figure out, such that nobody can really do it on a good time scale. And you just have to guess kind of at these functional process zone boundaries, and then the model then just becomes useless because it's meant to be that you don't have any human input into the groups of what you find, where pretty much everyone does. And then the whole kind of purpose of doing the model just pretty much falls apart. So take a look at, this slide here. What we've got here are different, this is that fish zones where you have, the trout, the grayling, and the bream, and the barbel. And this is a ways that you can study these different ecological models, where here what you have is the, that forested headwater, and then where you get coarse particulate and fine particulate organic matter with the riverine continuum concept. Flood pulse concept, remember, when big rivers flooding, that's what's important. Riverine productivity model is showing, well, these little green areas are showing where the periphyton are growing that are driving these fish. And then the river ecosystem synthesis is this little patchiness model, and then as you zoom in on these different patches, you're able to make predictions about the ecological processes that are going on in the river. But what I would say for all of these things is, we know the fish zone concept is bad, we know the RCC is bad, we know that the riverine ecosystem synthesis model is extremely hard to use. That kind of leaves us with the flood pulse concept, as we know it's important for big rivers that flood for a long time and flood predictably. We know that the riverine productivity model is good for big rivers where respiration is larger than photosynthesis. So as long as we kind of qualify these models, we know that these two are good, but we need to qualify them where they actually work. And you can kind of do that with a lot of different models. Riverine ecosystem synthesis model is helpful, but just too hard to use practically.